It's no surprise to me that we have a lot of active servicemen and veterans who watch our videos. After all, this is a war game. But have you ever wondered what it would be like to be part of the Imperial Guard, a human in the 40K universe? I know everybody's going to mention you die in 15 minutes. Sure, but there's more to that. And that's what we're going to talk about today as we dive deeper into Imperial Guard lore. What is it like to be part of the Astra Militarum? Let's first understand the organizational structure of the Imperial Guard. Across the millions of worlds that constitute the Imperium of Man, the primary defense against any alien or heretical threat is the Imperial Guard. There are more specialized organizations, such as the Inquisitorial Ordos, which stand ready to oppose the most direst of threats. There are those organizations with more firepower, like the Titan Legions of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the war fleets of the Imperial Navy, that can lay waste to entire cities in a matter of hours. There are more elite troops, like the genetically engineered warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, which stand at the pinnacle of human capabilities. Some would even say they transcend humanity. But despite this, none can doubt that the Imperial Guard is the most vital element of humanity's defense. From the ice halls of Valhalla to the steaming jungles of Catachan, from the perpetual night of Mordia to the blistering deserts of Talaran, uncounted millions of soldiers stand ready to crush the Emperor's enemies. They are normal men, but are often the byproduct of warrior cultures that reach back over the millennia, all firmly rooted in the martial pride of Terra. Within the Imperium, the sheer diversity of ancient cultures breeds countless types of soldiers, but within the Imperial Guard, this diversity is controlled and shaped to fashion an almost unstoppable weapon of war. Given the sheer size of humanity, this is a remarkable testament to the organization of the Imperial war machine. The Imperium is so vast that central control of its widespread domains is particularly impossible. Often it is difficult enough to ensure that the far-flung worlds remain loyal to the Emperor's cause, so controlling the day-to-day activities of these planets is a hopeless task. Because of this, the building blocks of the Imperial Guard are firmly based on military forces of individual worlds. Some Imperial worlds are governed by the Militarum, the Church of the Divine Emperor, while others are controlled by the Adeptus Mechanicus. There are even some garrison worlds administered as a military society by the Imperial Guard itself. These are in the minority, however. The majority of worlds are independently governed by Imperial commanders, normally with the approval and support of the Adeptus Terra, although events sometimes go faster than the distant bureaucracy can keep up with. Imperial commanders, also known as planetary governors, are the scions of powerful noble families, each with their own power base and a means to maintain control without any routine support from the Imperium. Each Imperial commander is responsible for defending his own world. This independence is essential. Warp communication is as unreliable as warp travel. Without local defenses, an enemy could overwhelm a world before any force could be dispatched to aid it, even if such aid even existed. Local forces are generally categorized as planetary defense forces. They are intended to be fully capable of defending their worlds against most attacks, and to be able to keep even a powerful enemy at bay long enough for the Imperial support to be dispatched. The promise of Imperial support, and the right to rule a world in the name of the Emperor, comes at a price, however. Each commander is a sworn vassal of the Emperor, and is responsible for providing military service in return. In the early days of the Imperium, this military service was a straightforward pledge to bring a set number of followers and fight in person. This approach was shown to be too inflexible as the Imperium grew, and was replaced with a tithe. A tithe is assessed according to the wealth and resources of the world, and can be taken in the form of men or materials. The method of assessment is arcane to say the least, and taxes the abilities of countless adepts and scribes. When a tithe is taken as troops, soldiers will be recruited in much the same way as the planetary defense forces. Sometimes the regiments raised are identical, the tithes being drawn directly from the planetary defense force. On other occasions, the regiments needed are raised specifically for service in the Imperial Guard. Normally, a tithe will be in two parts, the first being a regular obligation that is supplied regardless of circumstance, and then the second being an obligation that can be demanded in response to an unusual circumstance. The organization that monitors the tithes is the Departamentum Militarum. This is a colossal organization with representatives amongst the High Lords of Terra, like the Lord Commander Militant of the Imperial Guard, the Chancellor of the Estate Imperium, and the Master of the Administratum. The Departamentum Militarum is responsible for all aspects of the Imperial Guard. It deals with providing training, equipment, and supplies to the diverse arms of the Guard. It controls their mustering, transportation to and across war zones, medical and technical support, planning, and discipline. Its most impressive facilities are in the garrison worlds established throughout the Imperium. but any world with a substantial tithe obligation will have a Departamentum Militarum presence. The Departamentum Militarum is organized at a sector and subsector level, and each level has enough autonomy to respond to a local problem, normally acting to support Imperial commanders who need aid. They are empowered to raise regiments from worlds close to the crisis point in an increasing radius, as required by the crisis. The degree of the response will escalate to the level of the threat. If an Imperial world is invaded, the immediate defense will be provided by the Imperial commander and his planetary defense force. If these are inadequate, then the subsector command of the Departamentum Militarum will deploy its standing Imperial Guard regiments to augment the local forces. If more forces are needed, then the subsector command will raise additional troops, initially from nearby worlds, and then from any world in the subsector. As the commitment of troops grows, sector command of the Departamentum Militarum will become involved, and reinforcements will be drawn from more and more worlds. The outcome becomes that the harder an enemy strikes the Imperium, the greater the response will be. Now that we have a broad understanding of what an Imperial Guard regiment is and how it's organized, what would an individual like yourself have to go through in order to become an Imperial Guard Guardsman? We all understand that the life of an Imperial Guardsman is terrible. You are a simple human being launched into a battlefield filled with greenskins the size of Shaq, Dark Eldar raiders more sadistic than a 70-year-old Catholic priest, and acid-spitting tyrannids. So it becomes the duty of the Astra Militarum to mentally and physically prepare the soldiers of the Imperium on how to face such devastating enemies. The most relied upon method has always been the terror instilled into a guardsman by their commissar. But before a soldier is conditioned to fear the sight of a commissar's cap over the size of a charging orc, they are primed with the knowledge of how to survive on the field of battle. From a detailed guide of the enemies they will face to the function and proper maintenance of their weapons and war gear, all of this information comes in the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer. Upon recruitment to the Imperial Guard, each soldier is handed their very own primer. The naive guardsmen take this small black book and are instructed to absorb every detail possible. They are warned that no soldier should ever be found without possession of this primer, and if the field guide is lost, the punishment will be severe. Now, depending on the regiment and the theater of war, the content and organization of the book varies. The Astra Militarum tries its best to standardize the material, but there is no way to create a guide that fits all of the unique experiences our guardsmen will face. The more specialized the role, the more advanced and detailed the primer becomes. For the most part, the first section of these books contains a foreword, explaining the content and how best to use it. This is written by a high-ranking member of the Adeptus Administratum or a senior Imperial Guard officer. The Guardsman is given the same instructions as before. Read and memorize the details of this guide. This section tries to highlight the value of the primer and the importance of adherence to its text. To drive the message home, the following pages are a series of forms that are to be filled out by the soldier with their personal information and, more importantly, instructions on who to notify in case of the guardsman's death. This usually shocks the soldier into coming to terms with the reality that death will more than likely be the outcome if they deviate from the instructions of the primer. Now, the first chapter of most primers is a long rule set that each guardsman is to adhere to at all times. It usually lays out strict orders on everyday situations that are specific to their theater of war. It details all of the duties of a guardsman, from the importance of maintaining proper sanitary conditions like waste disposal, vermin control, and water supply, to how often each guardsman should be praying and venerating the God Emperor. The not-so-subtle propaganda jumps out right away. The first chapter makes sure to drive home the message that each action, even simple guard duty, is crucial to mankind's manifest destiny. In other words, each guardsman is contributing to the Imperium's continued rule over the Milky Way galaxy. These requirements are to be abided by at all times, and ignorance of them is not considered a valid excuse, since every soldier is expected to have read the primer and keep it on his or her person at all times. The second chapter of the primer is a lengthy section that describes all of the war gear issued to a guardsman upon their induction into the Imperial Guard. It goes into detail on how to correctly use each item and how to maintain it under the conditions that are specific to their theater of war. Special attention and extra information are provided in the lasgun paragraph, the auto pistol paragraph, the frag grenade paragraph, and the rebreather paragraph, as those are the most vital pieces of equipment to a guardsman. At the end of the chapter is a short description of additional, more specialized war gear a guardsman might request or be issued for special assignment, with a clear warning that training for such gear will only be given when the situation requires it, hopefully not too late. The third chapter is a very lengthy section that contains a comprehensive schematic of the descriptions of the Astra Militarum's chain of command. It includes multiple ranks and those that are external, such as commissars, engineers, and priests of the Adeptus Ministorum. Basically people that a guardsman might encounter in the course of his service, as well as the proper behavior when encountering such personnel, many of who will technically rank senior to most enlisted guardsmen. There then follows a section describing the organization of the standard Astra Militarum company. After the command structure portion, the chapter moves on to the very thorough explanations of how to deal with the many different situations a guardsman will encounter during his or her career. This is one of the most important and useful things in the entire primer. It is divided into many different sections and covers many different topics, but almost always starts off with instructions on how to navigate on the field of battle. This takes the form of map reading and compass calibrating, but also how to find their way to a designated location when they are left with no directional tools. Another very important section that piggybacks off the navigation is survival techniques, where the guardsman is given a series of survival tips to make it on their own or in case of delayed resupply. They are told where to look for water, depending on the environment, and standard hunting procedures. There is also a section that details what a guardsman should do if they find themselves cut off from their unit and behind enemy lines. They will be giving a brief but resourceful section of movement and cover both in and out of combat. This gives them all the possible terrain that they might encounter on a specific theater of war. And then there's a section that is dedicated to anti-aircraft security and protection, which basically reminds the guardsman to always remain vigilant and to stay motionless if an aircraft is spotted. He is warned to get into cover if at all possible when facing airstrikes or any type of airborne enemy. There is a very similar section that describes what to do if enemy armor is spotted. Basically, any anti-tank section that details the use of trenches, foxholes, or natural obstacles as cover. A soldier is reminded that they stand no chance against a tank and to let the heavy weapon squad deal with the threat. Only if the tank gets too close must a regular guardsman expose themselves to fire on its vision slits and make use of armor-piercing crack grenades if possible. And then there's a section on protecting oneself from gas, chemical, or biochemical threats. This section describes the physical symptoms to look out for in the event of the use of chemical or biological weapons by the foe, and reminds the guardsmen to call out an alarm before putting their rebreather, and never remove it if not cleared by a superior officer. They are also given detailed instructions on column movements, in other words, how to lead a marching column if the soldier is unlucky enough to be chosen as the head of the unit. Also a section instructing the guardsmen on how to link elements between different marching columns. Guardsmen will also be given step-by-step instructions on common battlefield scenarios like how to properly set up successful ambushes and how to storm a room. The entire section is dedicated to close-quarter fighting, as well as moving in and out of city blocks. A very crucial section is saved at the end of the book, where the soldier is given details on all additional duties that must be performed during warp transit. This portion is mainly designed to remind the guardsmen to remain watchful of warp psychosis, and to be extra mindful of discipline, as the enclosed environments of a void ship is hard on one's temper and nerves. Now we move on to the fourth chapter, which usually gives out brief explanations on the most common vehicles used by the Astra Militarum. As a guardsman, the chances of your regiment coming into contact with other regiments is fairly high, and so recognizing friendly armored companies as opposed to enemy tanks is crucial. That is why, along with descriptions of Imperial tanks, common Orc and Eldar vehicles are also described. There are brief explanations on how to identify weak spots on these types of enemy armored vehicles. The following chapter is almost always on the topic of alien enemies. There are usually lengthy descriptions of orcs, Eldar, Tau, and Tyranids, as well as smaller paragraphs on less common but equally deadly Xenos like the Hrud, Slann, and the Rakghoul. Depending on the theater of war, some of these species will not be included. For example, in the Eastern Fringe, the primer goes into detail on the Tau and the Crude, two Xeno species that are not included in the primers of other segmentums. The final full chapter is usually a very basic medical field guide. It covers the general description of the human body and the methods to deal with the types of injuries commonly encountered on the battlefield. Methods of field triage and moving wounded comrades are described in detail, and a list with the necessary medications for the most common afflictions are here. There is almost always a small section at the back called the Crimson Pages that includes all of the primary benedictions of the God Emperor. litanies, prayers, inspirational quotes, and uplifting creeds used by the Adeptus Ministorum. It also includes Adeptus Mechanicus prescribed litanies to replace the machine spirit of Guardsman's war gear when using it on the field and when performing routine maintenance tasks. Now that we know the contents of the primer, it's important to note that although it's filled with tons of information, the majority of Guardsmen hate the book. Veterans look down upon the contents of the primer because they see through the Imperial propaganda, exaggerations of Imperial strength, and the outright lies found within the book. This sentiment has led many regiments to refer to the primer as toilet paper. They are infuriated that the primer minimizes the threat of the enemy, and it mentions nothing of the threat of chaos. For example, the Gene Stealer is described as a weak, slow, and sluggish beast, a blatant lie. A Guardsman stands no chance against a charging Gene Stealer. But despite this, the primer provides quick references, solid descriptions, and numerous passages that are useful advice. It has saved the lives of many Guardsmen since it was first issued many standard centuries ago. Now let's say you do survive your 15-minute expected lifespan within the Imperial Guard. What would it be like to be a veteran within the Astra Militarum? To be a veteran of the Astra Militarum is to be of the hardiest stock in all of humanity. Fighting tooth and nail through extreme adversity, veterans are born survivors. Standing as the walking embodiment of humanity's resilience in the face of unrelenting savagery in the galaxy, a veteran has a lot to be proud of. Often quiet and reserved, a veteran spends most days haunted by the memories of his past, memories that stretch as far back as his childhood on his homeworld. As vivid as the day they happened, these nightmares become very familiar to veterans who have seen their lives flash before their eyes on numerous close encounters with death. While luck played a large part in their longevity, most veterans are no strangers to survival. Most have a history of beating the odds, starting on their birth planet, where as children they survive the harsh realities of life on a feral world or a war world. Growing up on a war-torn planet where the threat of open war made combat preparation and defense commonplace, these veterans came from an upbringing where learning how to fire a gun or memorizing evacuation drills was taught before learning how to read or write. Some came from savage worlds where tribal warfare taught them not only to be cautious of the many predators that lurk in the bush, but also to guard against their own kind. They witnessed betrayal and deception that created a heightened distrust for their fellow man, but which provided a self-resilient character that has contributed to their survival. Whether born on these worlds or on a common Imperial world, all veterans at some point were collected and trained by the Departamental Militarum. And this is an experience often never forgotten by most veterans, the day they were recruited, where they recall being rounded up and gathered like cattle for slaughter. Regardless of their distaste for the poor treatment that was implemented during their training as guardsmen, most veterans would gladly return to that time in their lives. Even with things like live round drills and commissar punishments, it all seems to be mild compared to the horrible realities they've experienced in war. Veterans have seen the faces of the Xenos, the Heretic, and the Mutant. Some have stood face to face with the dreaded Greenskins. They have heard the wild screams of bullish creatures that lumber towards the front lines, fearless of Imperial weapon fire. The smell of these disgusting, towering monsters lingers with them wherever they go. Some veterans are haunted by the slender and shadowy silhouettes of the Eldar Harlequins after surviving a terrible ambush or assault. Their movements as mesmerizing as they were deadly. Never have they, nor will they ever see an attack so well executed and with such precision and speed. While freshly recruited guardsmen stand tall and courageous when talking about mankind's enemies, a veteran knows that no amount of military propaganda will prepare them for the truth. Veterans choose to stay silent and prefer never to intentionally recall the dreaded foe that they have witnessed firsthand. And while new guardsmen speak of the enemy with arrogance and hatred, a veteran has come to understand a sense of respect for their foe. No matter how deformed or deranged they may appear, the opponent must always be thought of as a capable soldier, one with the capacity to take a man's life just the same as he would take theirs. It's one thing to be exposed to a poor soul that was overlooked by the Emperor's grace, such as a lowly mutant. It's a completely different thing to be ordered to hold a line while hordes of these bastard forms of man charge their position. After witnessing this, a veteran can't help but feel lucky every single day for being born under the protection of the Emperor, and has escaped the mutating effects that life away from the Imperium can cause. They have fought against men that crawl from the sewers of the hive cities, their visage as putrid and grotesque as the filth they crawled out of. They have entered into trench warfare against horned enemies that are more goat than man. But even when fighting a human foe, the veterans have been exposed to the corruptive propaganda spewed out by the traitors who turn their backs on the Imperium, and foolishly they have attempted to carve out an empire of their own. False gods, anti-imperial ideologies, corrupted planetary governors, the veterans have seen all manner of hubris rise against the Imperium, but the hammer of the Emperor has always been brought down to bear on the foolhardy. While not overbearing, the pride a veteran holds is much stronger than any member of a regiment. They have seen not only the glorious victory of a campaign, but also have felt the overwhelming pride of seeing their regiment's flag stand sentinel over a battlefield. After witnessing mankind's true foe, it is not far-fetched to believe that a veteran's loyalty to the Imperium would falter. But the reality is that for those men that have come out victorious from a campaign, the will to fight for humanity is strengthened, not by the litany shouted by the preachers, but rather the respect and loyalty each guardsman has for his fellow brother. Veterans hold an incredibly strong bond with their fellow survivors. In a galaxy filled with countless horrors, a veteran develops full trust in those brothers that have fought in the same hell they came across. Now, some veterans are spread throughout the regiment, as to inspire and educate new recruits, but most find comfort in spending their time with those that have witnessed the hideousness of war, and more importantly, will be prepared to face it again. Before a battle, a veteran finds his inspiration from the warriors that are as adept to war as he is. Commanders that have come out victorious from the very same campaigns they have fought. A veteran's respect for those long-serving soldiers that shared a battlefield with them is enough to spread confidence throughout the entire regiment. Unfortunately, there is one foe that has become synonymous with corruption and has the power to subjugate any man's will. It is the most abundant threat to the Imperium. It is the ruinous powers of chaos. The dreaded depravity of chaos not only haunts but drags down most veterans who have had the misfortune of facing it. Veterans who have peered into the eyes of the chaotically tainted traitor can never truly be the same. Chaos leaves a psychic scar on a human like no Xenos or mutant can make. Veterans must constantly remind themselves that the Emperor protects, and through his guidance, the filth of chaos will be washed away. Many of these veterans hold talismans and charms close to their bodies to ward off the evil that they have faced. These trinkets can take the form of prayer beads, small medals ingrained with an Imperial cult insignia, or small paper images of Imperial saints, all of which have been passed out to the veterans at some point in their lives by the priests of the Adeptus Ministorum. It is not until a guardsman feels the hopelessness of facing down a warp-tainted human that they learn to truly appreciate the worship of the Emperor. While not all Imperial veterans become pious, a majority can't help but find hope in the Emperor of mankind. A veteran who has seen the pervasive effects of the warp finds comfort in the prayers taught to them by the priest of the Adeptus Ministorum. Many of these veterans spend a portion of their day in quiet prayer or meditation, hoping to push away the twisted memories of chaos. Along with the mental and spiritual scars, most Imperial veterans also carry physical marks of the trauma that they have faced. A portion of their day must be spent cleaning and maintaining the augmetic implants they were unfortunate enough to receive. Severed or damaged limbs are replaced with cybernetic prosthetics, and they require some level of upkeep. These replacements actually enhance the bearer's fighting prowess, and while unfortunate, they can play a big part in the continued survival of most veterans. Amongst veteran cohorts, it is uncommon to find a warrior without some form of bionic. From bionic organs that have replaced a part of or the entire original organ, to implant weaponry that have superseded a hand or occasionally the entire arm. The quality and maneuverability of the implants are often a sign of rank amongst veterans. The augmetic implants most fit for open conflict tend to be reserved for sergeants or members of a vanguard, while simpler implants that are more practical are grafted onto most veterans. Along with bionic implants, all veterans hold honors awarded for all manner of heroic deeds or worthy actions by the Astra Militarum. While most veterans hold some form of medal citation or reward, it is often hidden or stored away. Few veterans enjoy standing out from the crowd, both on and off the battlefield, and so it is rare to find a veteran displaying his badge of honor. Now, the biggest hurdle most veterans must face is the daunting realization that regardless of victory or defeat, there will be no progress, for in their life there will only be war. Each veteran comes to terms with this grim reality, and their reasoning varies from regiment to regiment. Some veterans find peace of mind knowing that their death will spare countless others. Some find honor in dying for the Emperor of mankind. Others still are simply happy to know that someday their suffering will end. Once death is the accepted outcome, the veteran can wholeheartedly focus their attention to surviving even longer in order to kill more of the enemy. Veterans will find pleasure in watching the enemies of the Emperor fall beneath the might of the Imperium. They will gladly follow their battle brothers into combat again and again. Now, I wanted to talk about a veteran in the Imperial Guard before I get to the daily life of an Imperial Guardsman, just to soften the blow, because life as an Imperial Guardsman is rough. The day-to-day life of an Imperial Guardsman varies widely depending on the regiment and the world they are assigned to, but in general, all soldiers of the Imperial Guard share a common battle doctrine: to bring death to the enemy through bloody wars of attrition that can last for Terran months, years, or even decades. All Imperial Guardsmen were raised as soldiers since birth. It is rare to find a single Guardsman that has not been sculpted into a killing machine, trained to follow orders and hell-bent on destroying the Emperor's enemies at the cost of his own life. As a Guardsman, you are surrounded by people who have come to terms with the idea of death. To them, a battle is just another opportunity to demonstrate their worth and be accepted into the Emperor's army of light. Death is around every corner, and to treat it as something unordinary would be completely absurd. It is a topic joked about and spoken about, as if talking about sports or movies. There isn't a Guardsman alive that has not suffered the death of a comrade in battle, and once one campaign is over, it is on to the next. There are few Guardsmen who have been left unscarred by the legacies of their tours in many war zones of the Imperium. Guardsmen are haunted by the atrocities seen on the battlefield, from putting tourniquets on people's mutated and bleeding stumps, to watching whole units get disintegrated by Xenos weaponry. Only those with complete trust in the Emperor can come out of a situation this gruesome and still have the will to live. If a Guardsman lacks true faith in the Emperor, the field of battle quickly turns a skeptic into a true believer. His protection is not something preached about by the commissars. It becomes a necessity in the field of battle. For a Guardsman on his first campaign, it is extremely difficult to maintain courage in the face of the enemy. Even more so when the enemy is twice their size, green-skinned, and wants nothing but to see humans die. From the beginning, Guardsmen are told tales of the horrors of the heretic, the mutant, and the Xenos, but it is not until they face these creatures in the flesh that true dread sinks in. The realization that alone they are a small speck of soft pink flesh in a mountain of razor blades. Because military service is mandatory by all except the most noble of Imperial society, the ranks of the Astra Militarum are inevitably filled with those who are not cut for service. Those Guardsmen stand no chance in the face of the enemy that kills and tortures, not as a means to defend or protect, but for sheer thrill. This fear is utilized by the commissars, and it is used to fuel coherency within the battle lines. It is ingrained in every Guardsman that he is nothing without his unit. It is because of this that Guardsmen form extremely strong bonds with their fellow soldiers. A Guardsman learns to value the men and women who are still standing at the end of the campaign. They all share a bond that will never be broken, for they have fought the same enemy and survived to fight again. In between war zones, Guardsmen embark in the enormous ships of the Imperial Navy. These ships ferry the armies of the Emperor from planet to planet. Traveling within sector is a fairly calm and regimented ordeal. Guardsmen have their own sleeping quarters, with tiny bunks maybe 2 feet of headroom if they are lucky. They share this space with several 100,000 people. Some are fortunate enough to get curtains to slide close, but that is the most privacy a Guardsman will ever have. There are very few personal items a Guardsman carries. Everything is issued by the Adeptus Ministorum, but some Guardsmen may have enough room to fit small trophies of the battles of the past. The few hours of downtime that a soldier does have within the Imperial Guard
is often spent reading the various Imperial sanctioned books. Some contain tales of acts of heroism performed by Imperial Guardsmen of the past. Some are field manuals on how to deal with the hazards of Imperial battle zones. And others are books filled with what the majority of Guardsmen believe are myths about supreme beings called Space Marines. When the next campaign is sectors away, warp travel is required. The journey through the warp is a perilous one for everyone on board. The Militarum is filled with powerful etheric forces that would cause imaginable pain and suffering to any person that entered the warp unprotected. That is why all Imperial ships are protected by Geller fields. The Geller field creates a bubble of real space around the starship that it essentially carries into the Imperium. The Geller field protects the starship and its occupants from the hostility of the warp itself. Every Imperial Guardsman is in extreme danger when their transportation has to warp travel. Leaks within the Geller field are known to occur. When this happens, the ship becomes a giant metal trap. An unprotected human in the warp may be possessed by aliens, demonic entities, or driven insane by the phantasmal environment itself. People disappear without trace, while crazed mobs rampage through the decks, living out their nightmares, leading to widespread murder and self-destruction. Sometimes a vessel emerges from the warp physically intact, but with no trace of its crew. Many such ghost ships drift through the galaxy, and they are considered an ill omen by all those who encountered them while sailing upon the ebon sea of the void. Most trips through the warp take several weeks of travel, but time in the warp means nothing. To the passengers, what felt like a week of traveling might actually be years or seconds in real space. The disoriented crew must oftentimes be ready to deal with whatever wild circumstance that might be waiting for them, whether that be entering battle in a moment's notice, or waiting weeks for the initial assault of the battleship to be over. When the battle commences on this new planet, the enemy could possibly be different. While on most front lines, the enemy is a human, and the battle is to bring the world back under Imperial control. On some planets, the enemy could be something never before seen by man. Xenos infestation of unregistered creatures, or mutated chaos hordes that no longer resemble the humans that once lived on the planet. The threat will always be on the throats of whatever Imperial Guard regiment is sent to pacify the world. When casualties are at their highest and commissars are stretched thin, suicide and desertion is common amongst the ranks of the Imperial Guard. It is a sad truth that men, no matter how experienced they may be, will often turn tail when the opportunity presents itself. Deserters are often tracked down and killed, or at least that is what the Imperial commanders and commissars will tell the other guardsmen. In reality, escape is futile for a guardsman. To run from the enemy is simply avoiding death for a very short period of time. The very planet they have escaped into is as alien as the creatures they are fighting. A guardsman would not know where to go or who to trust. That is why many weak soldiers would rather take their own lives than to be overrun and possibly even captured by the enemy. The dangers of the planet are shared with all members of the Imperial Guard. Guardsmen have to adapt to horrible weather conditions, ranging from below zero temperature to toxic air. The sheer environmental hazards are enough to put soldiers away for good.
Now, after this deep dive, my question to you is, could you survive as an Imperial Guardsman? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you guys enjoy these deep dive videos, don't forget to hit the like button, do me a favor, and share this with your friends, and also comment down in the comment section below. The community is growing, so it would be awesome to hear what everybody has to say about these lowly humans in this giant galaxy of Warhammer 40K. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you want to support the channel, you can help us out with the super thanks or just supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk tomorrow. This is Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate signing out.
Oh, I used to put my